Good afternoon. Good afternoon from Vilnius, Lithuania. So today we have a presentation from the Australian-Lithuanian Cyber Research Network. So the network itself was physically launched in February in Melbourne, Australia. Today we're having follow-up seminars physically here in Lithuania. So in terms of today's events, there's going to be two parts. There's going to be a seminar presented by myself, Matt Warren, and then will then in part be my colleagues from Mykonos University will launch the website of the network, and we'll also talk about some of the research themes for the network that we want to focus on in the next year or so. So again, in terms of today, we're going to have those sort of two components which really helps to present our current research, but also talk about our future research. So in terms of part A, I'm going to be giving a presentation about some research that we've been undertaking in Australia. And I'm going to be talking about the cyber implications of a conflict in the South China Sea for Australia. Next slide. So I'd just like to acknowledge the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state of Australia, and RMIT is the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. And in 1954, Queen Elizabeth gave RMIT royal patronage, which means we're able to use royal in our title and also the royal family coat of arms. Next slide, please. I want to start the presentation with something that's quite unique to our Australian audience, and that's really an acknowledgement of country. So this is really an acknowledgement to our First Nation people in Australia. So RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Yuyang and Binyang language groups on the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of RMIT University. RMIT University respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past and present. RMIT University also acknowledge the traditional custodians and the ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business, and where even though today I'm in Lithuania, I know that many of my colleagues and audience members from Australia will understand the importance of this message. Next slide. So in terms of the research that I'm going to be talking about, the research was commissioned by the Australian Department of Defence to analyse the threats to Australian maritime supply chain through the Indo-Pacific region, with a focus on the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And as part of this project, through the Australian Department of Defence, one of the outcomes is to present our research findings. So in terms of my presentation today, this is actually, presenting our research findings to an audience within the European Union, to an audience within NATO. And I'd like to acknowledge the academic partners within that project. So RMIT University, the Australian Maritime College, that's part of the University of Tasmania, and Curtin University. So in terms of an overview, what we're seeing in the world is China's threat in regards to Taiwan underlines the need for Australia to be prepared for conflict in the South China Sea. With its growing Navy and Air Force and bases China has throughout the area, China has the capability to disrupt shipping lanes that are crucial to Australia's export and import. And here we have is a picture of one of the artificial islands that the Chinese government has created and on which, operates military facilities. So just to, give an indication of the South China Sea and the development of these artificial islands that have been created by the Chinese government gives an indication of the reach of China's influence from a sort of a navigational naval perspective across the South China Sea and very close to countries such as Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. So in terms of the scale of our problem, our research team calculated that if a major conflict occurred in the South China Sea, 90% of Australia's refined fuel imports would be impacted. This impact has an even greater prominence because over the last few decades, Australia has actually been closing down its local refineries. And at the moment, we only have 2 local refineries available, which would allow us to take fuel imports and to be able to refine them into fuel that, we could actually use within Australia. So it means Australia's facing a challenge that other parts of the world are also facing, and that's in regards to energy security. So what we're seeing in Europe is that energy security is becoming a greater problem and a concern. That's also the case in Australia. So my contribution to this project was really from a cybersecurity perspective. And what we found is that Australia, in terms of this project, face challenges from a number of cyber threat actors. State-based, we have the situation that countries or their proxies may wish to interfere with a country for a number of reasons, whether that's impacting their critical infrastructure, whether it's stealing intellectual property, whether it's causing political embarrassment, or whether it's power projection, to be able to project the power of a country into another country. The other threat group that we identified were criminal groups. And these are groups that are behind ransomware attacks. So what they want to do is use ransomware to deny an organization access to their data until a fee is paid. Or what they do is steal data and sell it on the dark net as a commodity. So certainly that's, from a cyber context, is the 2 sources of threat actors that we've identified. Next slide, please. Certainly from a European Union perspective, we see some very common similarities. So recently we've seen with the Belgian government raise concerns about the Chinese government. Next slide, please. So in July of the 22nd this year, what we have seen in Europe is that the Belgian government has accused China of undertaking malicious activities against Belgian government systems and Belgian defense systems. And the Belgian government has identified what are called advanced persistent threats, which are hacking groups acting on behalf of the Chinese government to steal information from those key Belgian government systems. Next slide, please. What we've also seen within a European Union context is the European Union imposing sanctions in response to cyber attacks. So in July 2020, we've seen the European Union apply sanctions against Russian, Chinese, and North Korean hackers involved in a wide range of cyber incidences, whether the NotPetya ransomware attack, the Cloud Hopper supply chain attack, or the WannaCry ransomware attack. And in October 2020, we also saw the EU impose sanctions on 2 Russian intelligence officers and a unit of the Russian GRU military intelligence over their involvement of hacking the German parliament in 2015. So what we're seeing is a situation where things that occur in the real world are linked to cyber activities. And what we've seen in terms of China is, a whole range of countries from the US, Australia, Canada, Japan, the UK, the European Union, and NATO condemn China for their cyber activities. So in terms of the research that we undertook as part of the project, what we focused on was 3 domain areas. One was around navigational disruption. One was around cyber physical infrastructure disruption in terms of ransomware. The other was about maritime supply chain disruption, and then maritime supply chain disruption from an export perspective. So in terms of the main of my presentation, that's really what I'm going to talk about, is those examples and then some of the recommendations. So in terms of navigation disruption, what we're talking here is in regards to ships. And within those ships, they have a whole range of systems, such as automatic identification systems, electronic chart information systems, global navigation systems, port facilities using GPS systems. And what we've seen is that many ships have become very dependent on these navigational systems. So if they were interrupted or affected, it would have an impact on the ships. Next slide, please. So what we've seen is a whole range of examples in real life where these navigational systems have been disrupted. So in the Black Sea in 2017, we saw 22 ships that were impacted by GPS spoofing, to the extent that one ship, according to their GPS system, was actually 32 kilometers inland, which from a navigational perspective is not a very good place to be. We've also saw with North Korea, over many years, they've been using GPS jamming across the north-south border that has affected thousands of aircrafts and fishing boats. We also more recently in 2018 saw a situation where a Norwegian warship accidentally collided with a Maltese oil tanker off Norway after a series of GPS jamming incidences during NATO military exercises. Next slide, please. So in terms of our study, what we identified with Australia is that there's a number of key shipping points where Australian shipping comes to from the Middle East, from Europe, to supply Australia. So we refer to these as choke points. Next slide, please. And what we identified was a whole number of scenarios that if the Malacca Strait was impacted by a GPS jamming attack, that we saw a situation that over 1,400 ships would be impacted. And the outcome of that would be that ships would have to slow down to such an extent to stop collisions. They would then try to seek alternative navigation approaches, such as traditional navigational approaches. The impact being that global supply chains would be affected. So it means it would take longer for products and services to get from Asia and Europe to Australia. The second scenario we looked at was the Lombok Straits. And again, we looked at the concept here of autonomous shipping. And these were systems on ships that allow them, to be operated with very reduced crews. And what the scenario was around, well, what would happen if a number of these autonomous ships were hacked and remotely controlled, in essence, closing down that Lombok Strait. And what we identified that if that shipping lane was disrupted for 21 days, it would impact 3 million tons of cargo worth over $3 billion. Next slide, please. The other example, one of the other scenarios we were looking at was ransomware in terms of ports and shipping examples. And there's many examples we can look at from this perspective. We saw in South Africa in 2021, where 5 South African ports were impacted by ransomware attacks for an entire week. We've seen 2020, the French shipping company CMA, CGM, have their Chinese operations impacted by ransomware. We've seen the Chinese company Costco impacted by ransomware that stopped all their shipping operations in the USA. But the most famous example relates to the Danish company Maersk that was impacted by the NotPetya ransomware attack. And really, this was one of the first examples of ransomware against shipping organizations. And it impacted 600 Maersk sites in 130 countries. And that attack cost Maersk $300 million in lost revenue and recovery costs. Next slide, please. So in terms of the scenario that we were looking at, what we were looking at was that Maersk scenario, but focused on Australia in terms of if there was a mass ransomware attack that was focused on Australian shipping routes in terms of shipping companies, ports, tugs, container management, what would be the impact? Again, the impact that we identified is like the Maersk example. It would take weeks to recover, which would lead to hundreds of millions of dollars in financial costs. But it would also have a social context in terms of disruption of fuel delivery, critical products such as medicine to Australia. Next slide, please. In terms of the other scenarios we're looking at, we looked at maritime supply chain disruption. And again, from an Australian example, we're looking at where ports and naval facilities had been the targets of hackers. So we identified in 2019 that the Port of Geelong was hacked, and a database of visitors and staff information was stolen. The other examples were more significant. In 2018, an Australian company, defense company called Austal, was hacked, and they had ship-designed data stolen. And the data was held to ransom by the hackers. So unless Austal made the payment, they would release those shipping information on websites. It was never known the outcome of that attack. In 2017, the Australian Department of Defence acknowledged a naval defence subcontractor was hacked, and 30 gigabyte of commercial data was stolen, but they also included the new designs of Australian naval frigates, and Australian anti-submarine warfare aircraft was also stolen as part of that hacking incident. Next slide, please. So in terms of the scenario that we looked at, it related to COVID-19, that a situation where there was a new strain of COVID-19 and there was only limited medicines to deal with that new strain. And Australia was importing that medicine from Europe. And what the scenario related to was that shipping company involved was a victim of a ransomware attack. And what we identified is in those situations, the medicine company would actually use the ransomware attack as a breach of contract, and would actually, not send those products to Australia. They would cancel the order, and they would then sell them, to another country at a higher price, and it meant that Australia would never receive the medicines. So again, in that scenario, what we explored was some of the legal implications of, a ransomware attack. Next slide, please. The final scenario that we were looking at was a port in Australia called Newcastle, which is a major port in Newcastle where we export coal from, $15 billion of coal per year. And each year between 2,000 and 2,500 ships berth at the dock. And what we identified was, a situation where two ships were hacked in the port and were rammed into each other, causing navigational issues. And what we identified in that situation is that the port would be closed for 3 months, and it would actually cost $4 billion in lost revenue. So again, highlighting where a cyber incident has real life implications. Next slide, please. So what we recommended from the cyber context is a number of recommendations around cyber security. The first one is that cyber security in a maritime perspective is extremely important and has to be improved. And whether that means developing specific guidelines around ransomware, around cyber insurance, there has to be an increased posture in terms of cyber security and shipping. The other area that we identified is the limited use of security standards within the shipping environment. And there's a whole range of security standards that shipping companies can implement, whether it's the NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27000, whether it's the Baltic and International Maritime Council guidelines on safety security on board ships, whether it's implementing Australian security guidelines such as the Essential 8 or the Australian Security Manual. So again, what we were recommending is that those Australian maritime organisations, as part of improving their cybersecurity posture, has to improve their cybersecurity capabilities by implementing standards. Next slide, please. What we also recommend was those shipping companies, making sure that the security features are tested, whether that's, using third parties to test systems to whether they work, actually strengthening, their current processes about reporting cybersecurity incidences. In terms of the GPS example and the spoofing examples, was actually, looking at alternative navigational systems that can be used, that's, that makes shipping companies and their ships not dependent just on the GPS system. Next slide, please. What we also, as part of that, identified navigation message authentication. So again, a way of stopping spoofing attacks. We also then, as part of the assessment, looked at realigning Australia's logistic network to safer protected countries that would allow rerouting. In terms of the scenario, that we identified, there were choke points. We identified, that there were vulnerabilities if a conflict occur with shipping going through the South China Sea. And it's looking at alternative routes that if conflict occurred, that the shipping could be moved to. We also wanted, to highlight the importance of cybersecurity in terms of supply chain and, enforcing more resilient and secure supply chains, especially if maritime conflicts occurred. Next slide, please. What we also saw is in a world where the importance of liberal rule-based countries is becoming more prominent, is Australia forming strategic alliances with countries around the world. And the Australian Lithuanian cyber research network is an example of alliances being formed. What we also identified, is the issues of outsourcing products and services, that outsourcing products and services to the other side of the world actually introduces vulnerabilities. So it's actually, if there is outsourcing to occur, whether it can be occurred in country or close to Australia. Our final recommendations, were around cyber resilience and raising awareness about cybersecurity within staff within the maritime industry. Next slide, please. As part of that, redesigning jobs of seafarers and shore staff to ensure that cybersecurity is something that they are aware of. Also wanting to ensure as part of that training that traditional seafarer skills are also taught. So, that people are able to navigate via the stars and not just depend on GPS systems. As part of that training, they have basic cybersecurity awareness. But one of the key areas that we wanted to focus on was that the Australian government actually identifies the importance of maritime cybersecurity for Australia and develop new initiatives in order to protect Australia's maritime cybersecurity and promote cybersecurity awareness. Next slide, please. So that was my recommendations with the report in regards to cybersecurity. In terms of the overall project, we had 5 recommendations. One is the issue about diversification of import sources. So we're not just dependent on one country for a particular product. The issue around our local refining capabilities. As I mentioned, Australia only has 2 refineries. Reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. Again, that's a task, that's going to take time, but something that the new Australian government's already, pledged that they want to look at. Increase strategic reserves of fuel. So if there was a conflict in the South China Sea, that there would be enough fuel reserves in Australia to deal with that situation in the short term. And the 5th point was actually about society, is to educate and prepare Australia for the population of possible shortages of fuel and what that would mean and the steps that they should take to prepare for that. So in a Lithuanian context, next slide, please. Again, what does that mean? Well, it means, that Australia is having to deal with the threat of energy security in the same way as Lithuania is also dealing with that threat today. Those factors and issues behind the threat are very different and they come from very different sources, but they have the same impact on both our countries. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Hello, everyone. So we are starting our second part of the event. As already been mentioned, today we are physically at Mykolas Romeris University, Lithuania. Professor Matthew Warren, who is visiting us in Vilnius, represents Australia's RMIT University and its co-director of Australian Lithuanian Cyber Research Network. Thank you, Professor, for interesting lecture.
Thank you.
And it's also me, Professor Darius Titilis, Dean of the Faculty of Public Governance and Business of Mykolas Romeris University, co-director of the network, and Associated Professor Marius Laurinaitis, another representatives of MRU, also joined us today. And now we want to announce the official opening of the website of the Australian Lithuanian Cyber Research Network and invite interested parties to become members of the network, as well as to contribute to the activities of the network. I also remind that on February 8th of this year, during the Safer Internet Day, the Australian Lithuanian Cyber Research Network was established to join efforts of qualified cybersecurity experts from Australia's Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and Mykolas Romeris University, Lithuania. The network seeks to unite cybersecurity, safety, fintech, and other innovation researchers so to cooperate and implement qualitative research. It undertakes partnership and seeks to join initiative with social partners to encourage expansion of the studies and research infrastructure. In addition, it encourages participation in national and international research programs. So today we would like officially open the web page of the network, which is available at first letters Australian Lithuanian Cyber Research Network.com. In other words, ALCRN.com. We have created this website to serve as a platform to connect various researchers and other interested parties through networking activities. On the website we have news section, specified contacts, links to the network, LinkedIn account, privacy policy, etc. And it's important to mention that the About section contains general provisions, goals, and aims of the network. I will read the main purpose of the network. The purpose is to connect cybersecurity researchers, students, and industry and government practitioners working or interested in Australia and Lithuania. Another aim of the network is to allow research institutions, associations, companies, even clusters to join the network. We consider it very important moment to publish the principles of the network. These are like values on which the activities of the network are based. You can read the principles in the website. And now about membership. We really want the network to connect various researchers, students, associations, natural or legal persons. Therefore, we strongly encourage participation in the network. Interested parties can connect to the network through the website. Please show that section. The application to participate in the network is submitted in electronic way. Potential members should fill quite short form, should fill some data, and agree with the principles that are published in the website. Membership is free and enables members to connect, stay updated on research and events in relations to Australia and Lithuania in cybersecurity and related areas. Participation in the network also provides opportunity to join ongoing research, initiate new research with network participants, conduct research, for example, on detecting misleading information in the media, including social networks. The aim of the network is to share information and develop partnerships within and beyond Australia and Lithuania. So welcome new members to join the network, and we hope that this initiative will be beneficial for all the stakeholders. And now I want to ask Professor Matthew to present research ideas that we discussed previously.
Thank you. So, as was mentioned, we've identified a number of research areas. So next slide, please. So we had the launch of the network in February 2022, and that was where the Lithuanian Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsberg opened our network physically in Melbourne. And again, one of the rationales behind setting up the network is that two countries on the other side of the world are actually bound together by principles, around democracy, around liberalization, around, a rule-based world. And cybersecurity is something where geography doesn't have an impact. So again, this has been sort of one of the key drivers with the network. And as Darius sort of mentioned, it's also reflected in our principles of the network. Next slide, please. So in terms of the in terms of the network, we've undertaken a number of initiatives. One of the initiatives is set up the Australian-Lithuanian Threat Observatory. And the idea of that is to undertake joint research looking at hybrid threats and how they impact Australia and Lithuania. And again, as part of that, we want to look at the society and organizational impacts of hybrid threats. Also looking at how those hybrid threats can impact Australia's and Lithuania's critical infrastructure, including democratic institutions. And as part of the research, we want to develop a number of thought leadership items and journal papers around these issues. The centre will have a physical location as well as a virtual location. It's going to be located in Melbourne, Australia, at the RMIT University Cyber Hub, and will be officially launched later this year. Next slide, please. So in terms of our network, what we've done is identified for 2022 and 2023 a number of research themes that we want to focus on. I mentioned the issue around hybrid threats and the observatory in relation to that. One of the other areas we want to focus on is fintech and cyber security. So in terms of fintech applications and fintech operations, cybersecurity is core to ensure the integrity of all of those different transactions, and is all core to the different technologies that can be used for fintech, whether it's the cryptocurrency, whether it's the application of blockchains. So again, we want that to be one of our focus areas. Another area is around cybersecurity threats to Australia and Lithuania, and really understanding what those cyber threats are, what are common, what are quite unique to Australia and Lithuania. Another key area is around fake news and disinformation. This is an area where Lithuania has had to deal with for a number of years, but it's something that's quite new to Australia, but has the impact, to disrupt both our countries, disrupt decision makers, disrupt democratic processes. Another area we want to look at is really into the future, and this is the impact of space and cybersecurity. So into the future, what we see is there's going to be critical infrastructure for both our countries that are actually going to be located in space. And there's a whole range of cybersecurity risks in relation to space and cybersecurity, whether that's land-based threats, whether it's the transmissions of signals from ground to space infrastructure, whether it's the different layers of space with low orbit, mid-orbit and outer orbit in terms of how infrastructure can be disrupted. And one of the interesting aspects around space and cybersecurity is the issue around legacy systems. There's a lot of space technology that's been launched decades ago that's still being used, but it's very hard to update and patch that infrastructure. The final theme that we're focused on is, again, an area around cybersecurity and education. And what we're seeing, around the world and with Australia and Lithuania is the importance of cybersecurity skills, how it's taught in the workforce, the importance of cybersecurity education in terms of how cybersecurity is taught, from a school level, and also how to deal with the cybersecurity skill shortages that both countries will face that will, impact our future cybersecurity skills and also our sovereign capabilities.
And also we have a lot of other ideas, but for the beginning, we want to concentrate on the areas that have been mentioned.
Yeah.
And as we see that in some cases, Australia has possibility to learn from Lithuania and vice versa. Lithuania has a lot to learn from Australian perspective, including cybersecurity.
That's for sure. We have one question for the audience related to the presentation you give us. And you mentioned about reducing fossil fuels and just explain more about it, how it's connected with the cybersecurity.
So again, it was an outcome of the project. So, it means if we're not as dependent on the fossil fuels, it means we don't have to import as much physical fuels into Australia. So it means, by using solar energy or using alternative battery power, it means that we reduce our dependence on those imports. So it means from a supply chain perspective, our society isn't dependent on those imports because we're able to generate our own power. And certainly, Australia is a very hot country. So in terms of solar power and battery storage, that's a key area, for Australia to focus on, as well as other forms of tech, of energy, such as wind and tidal.
And of course, all the software or network management system for the solar power plants and so on. So how it's related with the cybersecurity directly.
Yes, and again, what you then have is that development of new critical infrastructure around green power and how to provide that. I suppose another interesting area that we've seen is around cryptocurrency. It is actually the amount of power that is used to generate cryptocurrency, whether it's farming cryptocurrency, and there's a whole area of research around green cryptocurrency, again, to reduce that sort of energy dependency and usage. And I think this is going to become a common theme, for Lithuania, Europe, Australia, is how to deal with energy, because I think what's becoming very apparent is that we've all taken energy for granted, and now we're in a situation where energy is costing more to generate. Societies have to think smarter about, well, are the old ways of using or creating or developing energy the best ways, or do we focus on new approaches?
Yeah, that's for sure. And what's next important thing we should mention?
Of course, a lot of areas to research in the future. For example, in cybersecurity, from cybersecurity perspective, we can compare critical infrastructure sectors in Lithuania, in Europe, and Australia, and we can learn from each other countries. And of course, we should speak about new areas to be named as critical infrastructure. We will do research regarding those questions as well.
So certainly what's happened in Australia, we've just gone through a process of redefining what critical infrastructure is, and what we've identified as a number of new areas. So in terms of cloud and data storage has now been defined as part of Australia's critical infrastructure. Space is now being defined as Australia's critical infrastructure, and also universities have been defined as part of Australia's critical infrastructure in terms of the IP and future IP that universities generate in terms of Australia's economic well-being and future industry sort of sectors. And I think that's something we're going to see is as time evolves, is there's going to be a change in terms of what is critical infrastructure, and that's going to be different for each country.
So you mentioned education, and we need to explain more about one of the main goals, cybersecurity and education. It's related not only with the universities. We'll just talk
with all level of
education, starting from the kids, schools, and universities. So Australia has a lot of experience about high school and different programs which are now included in the study program of the schools and the universities. So we are very interested in it. So it's also related. As a Lithuanian has a lot of experience regarding the fintech industry and regulation, and after that, all issues regarding the cybersecurity. So yeah, we are all open-minded people, and we are invited to join us.
To join our network, to do research, to participate in the events. So we're waiting for new members of the network through our webpage.
Yeah.
So I think it's all for today. Thank you for participating in our short event today.
It was our short message to you. We're welcome to join us.
See you other times in another events.
Till the next meetings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.